A few days later, Penelope returned from a shopping expedition with Eloise, Hyacinth, and Felicity to find her husband seated behind his desk in his study. He was reading something uncharacteristically hunched as he pored over some unknown book or document. Colin? His head jerked up. He must not have heard her coming, which was surprising since she hadn't made any effort to soften her steps. Penelope, he said, rising to his feet as she entered the room. How was your, whatever it was you did when you went out? Shopping, she said with an amused smile. I went shopping. Right, so you did. He rocked slightly from foot to foot. Did you buy anything? A bonnet, she replied, tempted to add, and 3 diamond rings, just to see if he was listening. Good, good, he murmured, obviously eager to get back to whatever it was on his desk. What are you reading? She asked. Nothing, he replied, almost reflexively. Then he added, well, actually, it's one of my journals. His face took on a strange expression, a little sheepish, a little defiant, almost as if he were embarrassed that he'd been caught, and at the same time daring her to ask more. May I look at it? She asked, keeping her voice soft and, she hoped, unthreatening. It was strange to think that Colin was insecure about anything. Mention of his journals, however, seemed to bring out a vulnerability that was surprising and touching. Penelope had spent so much of her life regarding Colin as an invincible tower of happiness and good cheer. He was self-confident, handsome, well-liked, and intelligent. How easy it must be to be a Bridgerton, she'd thought on more than one occasion. There had been so many times, more than she could count, that she'd come home from tea with Eloise and her family, curled up on her bed, and wished that she'd been born a Bridgerton. Life was easy for them. They were smart and attractive and rich, and everyone seemed to like them. And you couldn't even hate them for living such splendid existences because they were so nice. Well, now she was a Bridgerton, by marriage if not by birth, and it was true, life was better as a Bridgerton, although that had less to do with any great change in herself than it did because she was madly in love with her husband, and by some fabulous miracle he actually returned the emotion. But life wasn't perfect, not even for the Bridgertons. Even Colin, the golden boy, the man with the easy smile and devilish humor, had raw spots of his own. He was haunted by unfulfilled dreams and secret insecurities. How unfair she had been when she'd pondered his life, not to allow him his weaknesses. I don't need to see it in its entirety, she reassured him. Maybe just a short passage or two, of your own choosing. Perhaps something you especially like. He looked down at the open book, staring blankly, as if the words were written in Chinese. I wouldn't know what to pick out, he mumbled. It's all the same, really. Of course it's not. I understand that more than anyone. She suddenly looked about, realized that the door was open, and quickly went to shut it. I have written countless columns, she continued, and I assure you they are not all the same. Some I adored. She smiled nostalgically, remembering the rush of contentment and pride that washed over her whenever she'd written what she thought was an especially good installment. It was lovely. Do you know what I mean? He shook his head. That feeling you get, she tried to explain, when you just know that the words you've chosen are exactly right, and you can only really appreciate it after you've sat there, slumped and dejected, staring at your blank sheet of paper, not having a clue what to say. I know that, he said. Penelope tried not to smile. I know you know the first feeling. You're a splendid writer, Colin. I've read your work. He looked up, alarmed. Just the bit you know about, she assured him. I would never read your journals without your invitation. She blushed, remembering that that was exactly how she'd read the passage about his trip to Cyprus. Well, not now, anyway, she added. But it was good, Colin, almost magical, and somewhere inside of you, you have to know that. He just stared at her, looking like he simply didn't know what to say. It was an expression she'd seen on countless faces, but never on his face, and it was so very odd and strange. She wanted to cry. She wanted to throw her arms around him. Most of all, she was gripped by an intense need to restore a smile to his face. I know you must have had those days I described, she insisted. The ones when you know you've written something good. She looked at him hopefully. You know what I mean, don't you? He made no response. You do, she said. I know you do. You can't be a writer and not know. I'm not a writer, he said. Of course you are. She motioned to the journal. The proof is right there. She stepped forward. Colin, please. Please may I read a little bit more? For the first time he looked undecided, which Penelope took as a small victory. You've already read almost everything I've written, she cajoled. It's really only fair to... She stopped when she saw his face. She didn't know how to describe it, but he looked shuttered, cut off, utterly unreachable. Colin, she whispered. I'd rather keep this to myself, he said curtly, if you don't mind. No, of course I don't mind, she said, but they both knew she was lying. Colin stood so still and silent that she had no choice but to excuse herself, leaving him alone in the room, staring helplessly at the door. He'd hurt her. It didn't matter that he hadn't meant to. She'd reached out to him and he'd been unable to take her hand. And the worst part was that he knew she didn't understand. She thought he was ashamed of her. He'd told her that he wasn't, but since he'd not been able to bring himself to tell her the truth that he was jealous, he couldn't imagine she'd believed him. Hell, he wouldn't have believed him either. He clearly looked like he was lying because in a way he was, or at least withholding a truth that made him uncomfortable. But the minute she'd reminded him that he'd read everything she'd written, something had turned ugly and black inside of him. He'd read everything she'd written because she'd published everything she'd written, whereas his scribblings sat dull and lifeless in his journals, tucked away where no one would see them. Did it matter what a man wrote if no one ever read it? Did words have meaning if they were never heard? He had never considered publishing his journals until Penelope had suggested it several weeks earlier. Now the thought consumed him day and night. When he wasn't consumed with Penelope, of course. But he was gripped by a powerful fear. What if no one wanted to publish his work? What if someone did publish it, but only because his was a rich and powerful family? Colin wanted, more than anything, to be his own man, to be known for his accomplishments, not for his name or position, or even his smile or charm. And then there was the scariest prospect of all. What if his writing was published, but no one liked it? How could he face that? How would he exist as a failure? Or was it worse to remain as he was now, a coward? Hmm. Later that evening, after Penelope had finally pulled herself out of her chair and drunk a restorative cup of tea and puttered aimlessly about the bedchamber, and finally settled against her pillows with a book that she couldn't quite make herself read, Colin appeared. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there and smiled at her, except it wasn't one of his usual smiles, the sort that light from within and compel their recipient to smile right back. This was a small smile, a sheepish smile, a smile of apology. Penelope let her book rest, spine up on her belly. May I? Colin inquired, motioning to the empty spot beside her. Penelope scooted over to the right. Of course, she murmured, moving her book to the night table next to her. I've marked a few passages, he said, holding forward his journal as he perched on the side of the bed. If you'd like to read them, to... He cleared his throat. Offer an opinion that would be... He coughed again. That would be acceptable. Penelope looked at the journal in his hand, elegantly bound in crimson leather. Then she looked up at him. His face was serious, and his eyes were somber, and although he was absolutely still, no twitching or fidgeting, she could tell he was nervous. Nervous, Colin. It seemed the strangest thing imaginable. I'd be honored, she said softly, gently tugging the book from his fingers. She noticed that a few pages were marked with ribbons, and with careful fingers she opened to one of the selected spots. The islands are oddly brown. March 14th, 1819. That was when I visited Francesca in Scotland, he interrupted. Penelope gave him a slightly indulgent smile, meant as a gentle scolding for his interruption. Sorry, he mumbled. One would think, at least one from England would think, that the hills and dales would be a rich emerald green. Scotland resides, after all, on the same isle, and by all accounts suffers from the same rain that plagues England. I am told that these strange beige hills are called tablelands, and they are bleak and brown and desolate, and yet they stir the soul. That was when I was rather high up in elevation, he explained. When you're lower or near the locks, it's quite different. Penelope turned to him and gave him a look. Sorry, he mumbled. Maybe you'd be more comfortable if you didn't read over my shoulder, she suggested. He blinked in surprise. I would think you've already read all this before. At his blank stare, she added, So you don't need to read it now. She waited for a reaction and got none. So you don't need to hover over my shoulder, she finally finished. Oh, he inched away. Sorry. Penelope eyed him dubiously. Off the bed, Colin. Looking much Chastened, Colin pushed himself off the bed and flopped into a chair in the far corner of the room, crossing his arms and tapping his foot in a mad dance of impatience. Tap, 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 tappity, tap, tap, tap. Colin! He looked up in honest surprise. What? Stop tapping your foot. He looked down as if his foot were a foreign object. Was I tapping it? Yes. Oh. He pulled his arms in more tightly against his chest. Sorry. Penelope refocused her attention on the journal. Tap, tap. Penelope jerked head up. Colin! He planted his feet down firmly on the carpet. I couldn't help myself. Didn't even realize I was doing it. He uncrossed his arms, resting them on the upholstered side of the chair, and he didn't look relaxed. The fingers on both of his hands were tense and arched. She stared at him for several moments, waiting to see if he was truly going to be able to hold still. I won't do it again, he assured her. I promise. She gave him one last assessing stare, then turned her attention back to the words in front of her. Colin watched Penelope as she read. Every now and then she would smile and his heart would leap, and then suddenly he realized that her smile had become permanent, and her lips were puckering as if she were suppressing a laugh. Colin realized he was smiling too. He'd been so surprised by her reaction the first time she'd read his writing. Her response had been so passionate, and yet she'd been so analytical and precise when she spoke to him about it. It all made sense now, of course. She was a writer too, probably a better one than he, and of all the things she understood in this world, she understood words. It was hard to believe it had taken him this long to ask for her advice. Fear, he supposed, had stopped him. Fear and worry and all those stupid emotions he'd pretended were beneath him. Who would have guessed that one woman's opinion would become so important to him? He'd worked on his journals for years, carefully recording his travels, trying to capture more than what he saw and did, trying to capture what he felt, and he'd never once showed them to anyone until now. There had been no one he'd wanted to show them to. No, that wasn't true. Deep down, he'd wanted to show them to a number of people, but the time had never seemed right, where he thought they would lie and say something was good when it wasn't, just to spare his feelings. But Penelope was different. She was a writer. She was a damned good one, too. And if she said his journal entries were good, he could almost believe that it was true. She pursed her lips slightly as she turned a page, then frowned as her fingers couldn't find a purchase. After licking her middle finger, she caught hold of the errant page and began to read again, and smiled again. Colin let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Finally, she laid the book down in her lap, leaving it open to the section she'd been reading. Looking up, she said, I assume you wanted me to stop at the end of the entry? It wasn't quite what he'd expected her to say, and that befuddled him. If you want to, he stammered. If you want to read more, that would be fine, I guess. It was as if the sun had suddenly taken up residence in her smile. Of course I want to read more, she gushed. I can't wait to see what happened when you went to Kinter and Mull and... Frowning, she checked the open book and the sky and Ullapool and Culloden and Grampian. She glanced back down at the book again. Oh, yes, and Blair Castle, of course, if you ever made it. I assume you were planning to visit friends. He nodded. Murray, he said, referring to a school chum whose brother was the Duke of Atholl. But I should tell you, I didn't end up following the exact route prescribed by old Angus Campbell. For one thing, I didn't even find roads connecting half the places he mentioned. Maybe, she said, her eyes growing dreamy, that is where we ought to go for our honeymoon trip. Scotland? He asked, thoroughly surprised. Don't you want to travel someplace warm and exotic? To one who has never traveled more than 100 miles from London, she said pertly, Scotland is exotic. I can assure you, he said with a smile as he walked across the room and perched on the edge of the bed, that Italy is more exotic and more romantic. She blushed, which delighted him. Oh, she said, looking vaguely embarrassed. He wondered how long he'd be able to embarrass her with talk of romance and love and all the splendid activities that went with them. We'll go to Scotland another time, he assured her. I usually find myself heading north every few years or so to visit Francesca, anyway. I was surprised that you asked for my opinion, Penelope said after a short silence. Who else would I ask? I don't know, she replied, suddenly very interested in the way her fingers were plucking at the bedcovers. Your brothers, I suppose. He laid his hand on hers. What do they know about writing? Her chin lifted, and her eyes, clear, warm, and brown, met his. I know you value their opinions. That is true, he acceded, but I value yours more. He watched her face closely as emotions played across her features. But you don't like my writing, she said, her voice hesitant and hopeful at the same time. He moved his hand to the curve of her cheek, holding it there gently, making sure that she was looking at him as he spoke. Nothing could be further from the truth, he said, a burning intensity firing his words. I think you are a marvelous writer. You cut right into the essence of a person with a simplicity and wit that is matchless. For 10 years, you have made people laugh. You've made them wince. You've made them think, Penelope. You have made people think. I don't know what could be a higher achievement. Not to mention, he continued, almost as if he couldn't quite stop now that he'd gotten started, that you write about society of all things. You write about society, and you make it fun and interesting and witty, when we all know that more often than not it's beyond dull. For the longest time, Penelope couldn't say anything. She had been proud of her work for years, and had secretly smiled whenever she had heard someone reciting from one of her columns or laughing at one of her quips. But she had no one with whom to share her triumphs. Being anonymous had been a lonely prospect, but now she had Colin, and even though the world would never know that Lady Whistledown was actually plain, overlooked spinster until the last possible moment, Penelope Featherington, Colin knew, and Penelope was coming to realize that even if that wasn't all that mattered, it was what mattered most. But she still didn't understand his actions. Why then, she asked, her words slow and carefully measured, do you grow so distant and cold every time I bring it up? When he spoke, his words were close to a mumble. It's difficult to explain. I am a good listener, she said softly. His hand, which had been cradling her face so lovingly, dropped to his lap, and he said the one thing she never would have expected. I am jealous. He shrugged helplessly. I'm so sorry. I don't know what you mean, she said, not intending to whisper, but lacking the voice to do anything else. Look at yourself, Penelope. He took both of her hands in his and twisted so that they were facing one another. You are a huge success. An anonymous success, she reminded him. But you know, and I know. And besides that, and besides, that's not what I'm talking about. He let go of one of her hands, raking his fingers through his hair as he searched for words. You have done something. You have a body of work. But you have— What do I have, Penelope? He interrupted, his voice growing agitated as he rose to his feet and began to pace. What do I have? Well, you have me, she said, but her words lacked force. She knew that wasn't what he meant. He looked at her wearily. I'm not talking about that, Penelope. I know. I need something I can point to, he said, right on top of her soft sentence. I need a purpose. Anthony has one, and Benedict has one, but I'm at odds and ends. Colin, you're not— you're— I'm tired of being thought of as nothing but Anne. He stopped short. What, Colin? She asked, a bit startled by the disgusted expression that suddenly crossed his face. Christ above! He swore, his voice low, the S hissing from his lips. Her eyes widened. Colin was not one for frequent profanity. I can't believe it, he muttered, his head moving jerkily to the left, almost as if he was flinching. What? She pleaded. I complained to you, he said incredulously. I complained to you about Lady Whistledown. She grimaced. A lot of people have done that, Colin. I'm used to it. I can't believe it. I complained to you about how Lady Whistledown called me charming. She called me an overripe citrus fruit, Penelope said, attempting levity. He stopped his pacing for just long enough to shoot her an annoyed look. Were you laughing at me the whole time I was moaning about how the only way I would be remembered by future generations was in Whistledown's column? No, she exclaimed. I would hope you know me better than that. He shook his head in a disbelieving manner. I can't believe I sat there complaining to you that I had no accomplishments when you had all of Whistledown. She got off the bed and stood. It was impossible just to sit there while he was pacing like a caged tiger. Colin, you couldn't have known. Still, he let out a disgusted exhale. The irony would be beautiful if it weren't directed at me. Penelope parted her lips to speak, but she didn't know how to say everything that was in her heart. Colin had so many achievements, she couldn't even begin to count them all. They weren't something you could pick up like an edition of Lady Whistledown's society papers, but they were just as special, perhaps even more so. Penelope remembered all the moments he had made people smile, all the times he had walked past all of the popular girls at balls and asked a wallflower to dance. She thought of the strong, almost magical bond he shared with his siblings. If those weren't achievements, she didn't know what was. But she knew that those weren't the sort of milestones he was talking about. She knew what he needed, a purpose, a calling, something to show the world that he was more than they thought he was. Publish your travel memoirs, she said. I'm not Publish them, she said again. Take a chance and see if you soar. His eyes met hers for a moment, then they slid back down to his journal, still clutched in her hands. They need editing, he mumbled. Penelope laughed, because she knew she had won, and he had won too. He didn't know it yet, but he had. Everyone needs editing, she said, her smile broadening with each word. Well, except me, I guess, she teased. Or maybe I did need it, she added with a shrug. We'll never know, because I had no one to edit me. He looked up quite suddenly. How did you do it? How did I do what? His lips pursed impatiently. You know what I mean. How did you do the column? There was more to it than the writing. You had to print and distribute. Someone had to have known who you were. She let out a long breath. She'd held these secrets so long it felt strange to share them, even with her husband. It's a long story, she told him. Perhaps we should sit. He led her back to the bed, and they both made themselves comfortable, propped up against the pillows, their legs stretched out before them. I was very young when it started, Penelope began. Only 17, and it happened quite by accident. He smiled. How does something like that happen by accident? I wrote it as a joke. I was so miserable that first season. She looked up at him earnestly. I don't know if you recall, but I weighed over a stone more back then, and it's not as if I am fashionably slender now. I think you're perfect, he said loyally, which was, Penelope thought, part of the reason she thought he was perfect as well. Anyway, she continued, I wasn't terribly happy, and so I wrote a rather scathing report of the party I'd been to that night before, and then I did another and another. I didn't sign them Lady Whistledown, I just wrote them for fun, and hid them in my desk, except one day I forgot to hide them. He leaned forward, utterly rapt. What happened? My family were all out, and I knew they'd be gone for some time, because that was when Mamma still thought she could turn Prudence into a diamond of the first water, and their shopping trip took all day. Colin rolled his hand through the air, signaling that she should get to the point. Anyway, Penelope continued, I decided to work in the drawing room because my room was damp and musty because someone, well, I suppose it was me, left the window open during a rainstorm. But then I had to, well, you know. No, Colin said abruptly, I don't know. Attend to my business, Penelope whispered, blushing. Oh, right, he said dismissively, clearly not interested in that part of the story either. Go on. When I got back, my father's solicitor was there, and he was reading what I wrote. I was horrified. What happened? I couldn't even speak for the first minute, but then I realized he was laughing, and it wasn't because he thought I was foolish. It was because he thought I was good. Well, you are good. I know that now, she said with a wry smile. But you have to remember, I was 17, and I'd said some pretty horrid things in there. About horrid people, I am sure, he said. Well, yes, but still. She closed her eyes as all the memories swam through her head. They were popular people, influential people, people who didn't like me very much. It didn't really matter that they were horrified if what I said got out. In fact, it would have been worse because they were horrid. I would have been ruined, and I would have ruined my entire family along with me. What happened then? I assume it was his idea to publish? Penelope nodded. Yes. He made all the arrangements with the printer, who in turn found the boys to deliver, and it was his idea to give it away for free for the first 2 weeks. He said we needed to addict the ton. I was out of the country when the column began, Colin said, but I remember my mother and sisters telling me all about it. Penelope grumbled when the newsboys demanded payment after 2 weeks for free. Penelope said, but they all paid. A bright idea on the part of your solicitor, Colin murmured. Yes, he was quite savvy. He picked up on her use of the past tense, was. She nodded sadly. He passed on a few years ago, but he knew he was ill, and so before he died, he asked me if I wanted to continue. I suppose I could have stopped then, but I had nothing else in my life, and certainly no marriage prospects. She looked up quickly. I don't mean to, that is to say, his lips curved into a self-deprecating smile. You may scold me all you wish for not having proposed years ago. Penelope returned his smile with one of her own. Was it any wonder she loved this man? But, he said rather firmly, only if you finish the story. Right, she said, forcing her mind back to the matter at hand. After Mr. She looked up hesitantly. I'm not certain I should say his name. Colin knew she was torn between her love and trust for him and her loyalty to a man who had, in all probability, been a father to her once her own had departed this earth. It's all right, he said softly. He's gone. His name doesn't matter. She let out a soft breath. Thank you, she said, chewing on her lower lip. It's not that I don't trust you. I know, he said reassuringly, squeezing her fingers with his. If you want to tell me later, that's fine, and if you don't, that will be fine as well. She nodded, her lips tight at the corners, in that strained expression people get when they are trying hard not to cry. After he died, I worked directly with the publisher. We set up a system for delivery of the column, and the payments continued the way they had always been made, into a discreet account in my name. Colin sucked in his breath as he thought about how much money she must have made over the years, but how could she have spent it without incurring suspicion? Did you make any withdrawals? He asked. She nodded. After I'd been working about 4 years, my great-aunt passed away and left her estate to my mother. My father's solicitor wrote the will. She didn't have very much, so we took my money and pretended it was hers. Penelope's face brightened slightly as she shook her head in bewilderment. My mother was surprised. She'd never dreamed Aunt Georgette had been so wealthy. She smiled for months. I've never seen anything like it. It was very kind of you, Colin said. Penelope shrugged. It was the only way I could actually use my money. But you gave it to your mother, he pointed out. She's my mother, she said, as if that ought to explain everything. She supported me. It all trickled down. He wanted to say more, but he didn't. Portia Featherington was Penelope's mother, and if Penelope wanted to love her, he wasn't going to stop her. Since then, Penelope said, I haven't touched it. Well, not for myself. I've given some money to charities. Her face took on a wry expression, anonymously. He didn't say anything for a moment, just took the time to think about everything she had done in the last decade, all on her own, all in secret. If you want the money now, he finally said, you should use it. No one will question your suddenly having more funds. You're Bridgerton after all. He shrugged modestly. It's well known that Anthony settled ample livings upon all of his brothers. I wouldn't even know what to do with it all. Buy something new, he suggested. Didn't all women like to shop? She looked at him with an odd, almost inscrutable expression. I'm not sure you understand how much money I have, she said hedgingly. I don't think I could spend it all. Put it aside for our children, then, he said. I've been fortunate that my father and my brother saw fit to provide for me, but not all younger sons are so lucky. And daughters, Penelope reminded him. Our daughter should have money of their own, separate from their dowries. Colin had to smile. Such arrangements were rare, but trust Penelope to insist upon it. Whatever you wish, he said fondly. She smiled and sighed, settling back against the pillows. Her fingers idly danced across the skin on the back of his hand, but her eyes were far away, and he doubted she was even aware of her movements. I have a confession to make, she said, her voice quiet and even, just a touch of sly. He looked at her doubtfully. Bigger than Whistledown? Different. What is it? She dragged her eyes off the random spot on the wall she seemed to be focused upon, and gave him her full attention. I've been feeling a little bit. She chewed on her lip as she paused, searching for the right words. Impatient with you lately. No, that's not right, she said, disappointed really. An odd feeling began to prickle in his chest. Disappointed how? He asked carefully. Her shoulders gave a little shrug. You seemed so upset with me about Whistledown. I already told you that was because. No, please, she said, placing a gently restraining hand on his chest. Please let me finish. I told you I thought it was because you were ashamed of me, and I tried to ignore it, but it hurt so much, really. I thought I knew who you were, and couldn't believe that person would think himself so far above me that he would feel such shame at my achievements. He stared at her silently, waiting for her to continue. But the funny thing is, she turned to him with a wise smile. The funny thing is that it wasn't because you were ashamed at all. It was all because you wanted something like that for your own, something like Whistledown. It seems silly now, but I was so worried because you weren't the perfect man of my dreams. No one is perfect, he said quietly. I know. She leaned over and planted an impulsive kiss on his cheek. You're the imperfect man of my heart, and that's even better. I'd always thought you infallible, that your life was charmed, that you had no worries or fears or unfulfilled dreams, but that wasn't really fair of me. I was never ashamed of you, Penelope, he whispered. Never. They sat in companionable silence for a few moments, and then Penelope said, do you remember when I asked you if we might take a belated honeymoon trip? He nodded. Why don't we use some of my Whistledown money for that? I will pay for the honeymoon trip. Fine, she said, with a lofty expression. You may take it out of your quarterly allowance. He stared at her in shock, then hooted with laughter. You are going to give me pin money? He asked, unable to control the grin that spread across his face. Pen money, she corrected, so you can work on your journals. Pen money, he mused. I like that. She smiled and placed her hands on his. I like you. He squeezed her fingers. I like you too. Penelope sighed as she settled her head on his shoulder. Is life supposed to be this wonderful? I think so, he murmured. I really do. Aw. 1 week later, Penelope was sitting at the desk in her drawing room, reading Colin's journal and making notes on a separate piece of paper whenever she had a question or comment. He had asked her to help him edit his writing, a task she found thrilling. She was, of course, overjoyed that he had entrusted this critical job to her. It meant he trusted her judgment, thought she was smart and clever, felt that she could take what he had written and make it even better. But there was more to her happiness than that. She had needed a project, something to do, and the first days after giving up Whistledown, she had reveled in her newfound free time. It was like having a holiday for the first time in 10 years. She'd read like mad, all those novels and books she'd purchased, but never gotten around to reading. And she'd taken long walks, ridden her horse in the park, sat in the small courtyard behind her house on Mount Street, enjoying the fine spring weather, and tipping her face upward to the sun for a minute or so at a time, long enough to bask in the warmth, but not so long as to turn her cheeks brown. Then, of course, the wedding and its myriad details had consumed all of her time, so she really hadn't had much opportunity to realize what might be missing in her life. When she had been doing the column, the actual writing of it hadn't taken too terribly long, but she always had to be on alert, watching and listening. And when she wasn't writing the column, she was thinking about writing the column, or desperately trying to remember some clever turn of phrase until she could get home and jot it down. It had been mentally engaging, and she hadn't realized how much she'd missed having her mind challenged until now, when she had finally been given the opportunity again. She was jotting down a question about Colin's description of Tucson Villa on page 143 in volume 2 of his journals, when the butler knocked discreetly on the open door to alert her to his presence. Penelope smiled sheepishly. She tended to absorb herself entirely in her work, and Dunwoody had learned through trial and error that if he wanted to get her attention, he had to make some noise. "A visitor to see you, Mrs. Bridgerton," he said. Penelope looked up with a smile. It was probably one of her sisters, or maybe one of the Bridgertons, a sibling. "Really? Who is it?" He stepped forward and handed her a card. Penelope looked down and gasped, first in shock and then in misery. Engraved in classic, stately black on a creamy white background were two simple words: Lady Toomley. Cressida Toomley? Why on earth would she come calling? Penelope began to feel uneasy. Cressida would never call unless it was for some unpleasant purpose. Cressida never did anything unless it was for an unpleasant purpose. "Would you like me to turn her away?" Dunwoody asked. "No," Penelope said with a sigh. She wasn't a coward, and Cressida Toomley wasn't going to turn her into one. "I'll see her. Just give me a moment to put my papers away." But Dunwoody stopped in his tracks and cocked his head slightly to the side, waiting for her to go on. "Oh, never mind," Penelope muttered. "Are you certain, Mrs. Bridgerton?" "Yes. No," she groaned. She was dithering, and it was one more transgression to add to Cressida's already long list of them. She was turning Penelope into a stammering fool. "What I mean is, if she's still here after 10 minutes, would you devise some sort of emergency that requires my presence? My immediate presence? I believe that can be arranged." "Excellent, Dunwoody," Penelope said with a weak smile. It was perhaps the easy way out, but she didn't trust herself to be able to find the perfect point in the conversation to insist that Cressida leave, and the last thing she wanted was to be trapped in the drawing room with all her emotions that afternoon. The butler nodded and left, and Penelope shuffled her papers into a neat stack, closing Colin's journal and setting it on top so that The breeze from the open window couldn't blow the papers off the desk. She stood and walked over to the sofa, sitting down in the corner or in the center, hoping that she looked relaxed and composed, as if a visit from Cressida Toomley could ever be called relaxing. A moment later, Cressida arrived, stepping through the open doorway as Dunwoody intoned her name. As always, she looked beautiful, every golden hair on her head in its perfect place. Her skin was flawless, her eyes sparkled, her clothing was of the latest style, and her reticule matched her attire to perfection. "Cressida," Penelope said, "how surprising to see you." Surprising being the most polite adjective she could come up with under the circumstance. Cressida's lips curved into a mysterious, almost feline smile. "I'm sure it is," she murmured. "Won't you sit down?" Penelope asked, mostly because she had to. She spent a lifetime being polite. It was difficult to stop now. She motioned to a nearby chair, the most uncomfortable one in the room. Cressida sat on the edge of the chair, and if she found it less than pleasing, Penelope could not tell from her mien. Her posture was elegant, her smile never faltered, and she looked as cool and composed as anyone had a right to be. "I'm sure you're wondering why I'm here," Cressida said. There seemed a little reason to deny it, so Penelope nodded. And then, abruptly, Cressida asked, "How are you finding married life?" Penelope blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "It must be an amazing change of pace," Cressida said. "Yes," Penelope said carefully, "but a welcome one." Yes. You must have a dreadful amount of free time now. I'm sure you don't know what to do with yourself." A prickling feeling began to spread through Penelope's skin. "I don't understand your meaning," she said. "Don't you?" When it became apparent that Cressida required an answer, Penelope replied somewhat testily, "No, I don't." Cressida was silent for a moment, but her cat with cream expression spoke volumes. She glanced about the room until her eyes fell on the writing desk where Penelope had so recently been sitting. "What are those papers?" she inquired. Penelope's eyes flew to the papers on the desk, stacked neatly under Colin's journal. There was no way that Cressida could have known that they were anything special. Penelope had already been seated on the sofa when Cressida entered the room. "I fail to see how my personal papers could be of your concern," she said. "Oh, do not take offense," Cressida said with a little tinkle of laughter that Penelope found rather frightening. "I was merely making polite conversation, inquiring about your interests." "I see," Penelope said, trying to fill the ensuing silence. "I'm very observant," Cressida said. Penelope raised her brows in question. "In fact, my keen powers of observation are quite well known among the very best circles of society." "I must not be a link in those impressive circles, then," Penelope murmured. Cressida, however, was far too involved in her own speech to acknowledge Penelope's. "It's why," she said in a thoughtful tone of voice, "I thought I might be able to convince the ton that I was really Lady Whistledown." Uh-oh. Penelope's heart thundered in her chest. "Then you admit that you're not?" she asked carefully. "Oh, I think you know I'm not." Uh-oh. Penelope's throat began to close. Somehow, she'd never know how she managed to keep her composure and say, "I beg your pardon." Cressida smiled, but she managed to take that happy expression and turn it into something sly and cruel. "When I came up with this ruse, I thought, I can't lose. Either I convince everyone I am Lady Whistledown, or they won't believe me, and I look very cunning. when I say that I was just pretending to be Lady Whistledown in order to ferret out the true culprit. Penelope held very silent, very still. But it didn't quite play out the way I had planned. Lady Whistledown turned out to be far more devious and mean-spirited than I would have guessed. Cressida's eyes narrowed, then narrowed some more until her face, normally so lovely, took on a sinister air. Her last little column turned me into a laughing-stock. Penelope said nothing, barely daring to breathe. And then, Cressida continued, her voice dropping into lower registers, and then you had the effrontery to insult me in front of the entire ton. Penelope breathed a tiny sigh of relief. Maybe Cressida didn't know her secret. Maybe this was all about Penelope's public insult, when she'd accused Cressida of lying, and she'd said, dear God, what had she said? Something terribly cruel, she was sure, but certainly well deserved. I might have been able to tolerate the insult if it had come from someone else, Cressida continued, but from someone such as you, well, that could not go unanswered. You should think twice before insulting me in my own home, Penelope said in a low voice, and then she added, even though she hated to hide behind her husband's name, I'm a Bridgerton now. I carry the weight of their protection. Penelope's warning made no dent in the satisfied mask that molded Cressida's beautiful face. I think you had better listen to what I have to say before you make threats. Penelope knew she had to listen. It was better to know what Cressida knew than to close her eyes and pretend all was well. Go on, she said, her voice deliberately curt. You made a critical mistake, Cressida said, pointing her index finger at Penelope and wagging it back and forth in short, tick-tocky motions. It didn't occur to you that I never forget an insult, did it? What are you trying to say, Cressida? Penelope had wanted her words to seem strong and forceful, but they came out as a whisper. Cressida stood and walked slowly away from Penelope, her hips swaying slightly as she moved, the motion almost like a swagger. Let me see if I can remember your exact words, she said, tapping one finger against her cheek. Oh, no, don't remind me. I am sure it will come to me. Oh, yes, I recall now. She turned around to face Penelope. I believe you said you'd always liked Lady Whistledown, and then, and to give credit, it was an evocative, memorable turn of a phrase. You said that it would break your heart if she turned out to be someone like Lady Toomley, Cressida said, which would be me. Penelope's mouth went dry, her fingers shook, and her skin turned to ice. Oof. Because while she hadn't remembered exactly what she'd said in her insult to Cressida, she did remember what she'd written in the last final column, the one which had been mistakenly distributed at her engagement ball, the one which Cressida was now slapping down onto the table in front of her. Ladies and gentlemen, this author is not Lady Cressida Toomley. She is nothing more than a scheming impostor, and it would break my heart to see my years of hard work attributed to one such as her. Ooh. Penelope stared down at the words, even though she knew each one by heart. What do you mean? She asked, even though she knew her attempt to pretend that she didn't know exactly what Cressida meant was futile. You're smarter than that, Penelope Featherington, Cressida said. You know I know. Penelope kept staring at the single incriminating sheet of paper, unable to tear her eyes from those fateful words. It would break my heart, break my heart, break my— Nothing to say? Cressida asked, and even though Penelope could not see her face, she felt her hard, supercilious smile. No one will believe you, Penelope whispered. I can barely believe it myself, Cressida said with a harsh laugh. You, of all people. But apparently you had hidden depths and were a bit more clever than you let on. Clever enough, she added with a noticeable emphasis, to know that once I light the spark of this particular piece of gossip, the news will spread like wildfire. Penelope's mind whirled in dizzying, unpleasant circles. Oh gosh, what was she going to tell Colin? How would she tell him? She knew she had to, but where would she find the words? No one will believe it at first, Cressida continued. You were right about that. But then they'll start to think, and slowly but surely the pieces of the puzzle will fall into place. Someone will remember that they said something to you that ended up in a column, or that you were at a particular house party, or that they'd seen Eloise Bridgerton snooping about. And doesn't everyone know that the two of you tell each other everything? What do you want? Penelope asked, her voice low and haunted, as she finally lifted her head to face her enemy. Ah, now there's a question I've been waiting for. Cressida clasped her hands together behind her back and began to pace. I've been giving the matter a great deal of thought. In fact, I put off coming here to see you for almost a full week until I could decide upon the matter. Penelope swallowed, uncomfortable with the notion that Cressida had known her deepest secret for nearly a week, and she'd been blithely living her life, unaware that the sky was about to come crashing down. I knew from the onset, of course, Cressida said, that I wanted money, but the question was, how much? Your husband is a Bridgerton, of course, and so he has ample funds. But then again, he's a younger son, and not as plump in the pocket as the Viscount. How much, Cressida? Penelope ground out. She knew that Cressida was drawing this out just to torture her, and she had little hope that she would actually name a figure before she was good and ready. Then I realized, Cressida continued, ignoring Penelope's question and proving her point, that you must be quite wealthy too, unless you're an utter fool, and considering your success at hiding your little secret for so long, I've revised my initial opinion of you, so I don't think you are. You'd have to have made a fortune after writing the column for all those years, and from all outward appearances. She gave a scornful glance to Penelope's afternoon dress. You haven't been spending it, so I can only deduce that it is all sitting in a discreet little bank account somewhere, just waiting for a withdrawal. How much, Cressida? £10,000. Penelope gasped. You're mad. No, Cressida smiled. Just very, very clever. I don't have £10,000. I think you're lying. I can assure you I'm not, and she wasn't. The last time Penelope had checked her account, she'd had £8,246, although she supposed that with interest it had grown by a few pounds since then. It was an enormous sum of money, to be sure, enough to keep any reasonable person happy for several lifetimes. But it wasn't 10,000, and it wasn't anything she wished to hand over to Cressida Toomley. Cressida smiled serenely. I'm sure you'll figure out what to do. Between your savings and your husband's money, £10,000 is a paltry sum. £10,000 is never a paltry sum. How long will you need to gather your funds? Cressida asked, completely ignoring Penelope's outburst. A day? 2 days? 2 days, Penelope echoed, gaping. I couldn't do it in 2 weeks. Aha, so then you do have the money. I don't. 1 week, Cressida said, her voice turning sharp. I want the money in 1 week. I won't give it to you, Penelope whispered, more for her own benefit than Cressida's. You will, Cressida replied confidently. If you don't, I'll ruin you. Mrs. Bridgerton? Penelope looked up to see Dunwoodie standing in the doorway. There's an urgent matter which requires your attention, he said immediately. Just as well, Cressida said, walking toward the door. I am done here. She walked through the doorway, then turned around once she reached the hall, so that Penelope was forced to look at her, perfectly framed in the portal. I'll hear from you soon, she inquired, her voice mild and innocent, as if she were talking about nothing more weighty than an invitation to a party, or perhaps the agenda for a charity meeting. Penelope gave her a little nod, just to be rid of her. But it didn't matter. The front door may have thunked shut, and Cressida might be gone, but Penelope's troubles weren't going anywhere.